Hello and welcome to the fourth in a series of podcasts looking at radio production. All of these podcasts are directly linked to the university's curriculum and should be used to support, not replace, the teaching in the classroom. In this podcast, I'll be looking at the art of interviewing musicians. I am joined by presenter and producer Robin Valk. Robin has many years of experience, having worked as a DJ here and in America before becoming a producer at BBC Radio 2. Robin now runs his own online station and blog called Radio To Go. I started by asking Robin how he decides the style or tone of the interview he is doing for any given programme.
I've only ever done music interviews, so therefore I'm interviewing someone whose music I know, and I make a point of listening to what they've got so as I know the music they make. So that means I can talk to them about their music and with a bit of luck get an inkling of what they're like. And if it's someone that I've seen locally, I'll have a feel for what they're like as people. I can talk about the issues that matter to them if they're starting out on their career. Like you ask a songwriter what his creative process is, you will never get the same answer, but they love answering that song. They love answering that question. When you're doing big name people, you're dealing with their reputation. So that's how you handle that particular issue. That's what I would say most music interviewers would do. Right, so how do you get it right? Preparation. One of the interesting things on getting it right is if you really don't know the artist, what the hell are you doing talking to in the first place? There was one guy who did book interviews on an old station of mine. Now, prepping on a book, that's a fair amount of work. You've got to read the damn thing. Whilst an album, you've gone through it in 40 minutes flat. There was one time when he interviewed a very, very famous tough feminist author about her very tough feminist book. And I was listening to it, and 5 minutes into the conversation, he said, "Well, it's clear to me you haven't read the book, have you?" Instant death. How do you get interviews to open up? You like them. You fall in love with them a little bit. If you're interested in them, and especially if they're performers, they react well to the fact that you're interested in them. And you don't ask them stupid stuff about what's your favourite colour or what's your star sign. You ask them about what they do. People love to talk about themselves. That's the easiest way to get an interview going. What makes you tick? Tell me about yourself. That kind of stuff. Tell me about your insecurities. Tell me about the challenges you had in doing this kind of stuff. And they'll tell you, normally. If the interviewer doesn't want to answer tough questions, again, it's difficult for me to give you a precise answer on that because I'm talking about interviewing people whom I like, whom I'm interested in. So there's almost a reaction to that. But I can think that there was one fairly tough interview I did very, very early on in my career, and it was a band who were called the Tourists, and the two main people in the Tourists were the guys who became Eurythmics, Annie Lennox and Dave Stewart. Annie Lennox was just not happy to be there. She really was not. She didn't feel in control. She was miserably unhappy, and I felt by asking her questions I was really making her feel uncomfortable, and it was a very awkward situation. There was a parallel situation with that, with Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders, who was dragged out on an interview circuit of commercial radio, and I was talking to her, and she just didn't want to be there either. And it's interesting because they're both strong women performers, but they didn't feel in control at that point. No question about it, they weren't happy. So getting them to open up, that's like torturing them. You can't do that. At which point you see if you can get the best value out of it, and Dave Stewart was fine. He was perfectly cooperative. He was playing the game. That's okay. I got something worthwhile. It would have been better if I got stuff out of Annie Lennox because she's a really interesting, powerful woman, but I didn't. Nothing you can do about that. There must have been times when you've not liked the interview, and how do you treat them fairly? Well, that's an interesting point, but are you under any obligation to treat your interview guest fairly? If the interview guest isn't treating you fairly, why should you have to be a punch bag for them? It's a quid pro quo. You are getting an interview because whoever you're interviewing has agreed to be interviewed, and normally it's for publicity purposes. If it's music interview stuff and music industry stuff, it's definitely publicity purposes. If they're then going to be arsy with you because they're bored of doing an interview tour, and I sympathise with that completely, but I don't see why I should be a punchbag if they're having a hard time. So it's a question of, at that point, the last thing I would ever want to do would be to destroy someone in an interview. I've heard that happen. I think it's cruel and vicious and unfair, and there are some musicians who are very vulnerable and very open. That's because their music is like that, and it would be absolutely wrong to behave that way. On the other hand, if someone comes in and gives you a hard time, but they're tough, then there's nothing wrong with your toughening up right back, and sometimes that can give you quite an interesting interview. I can give you 2 examples of that. The first one was Meatloaf. Meatloaf was and is a bombastic, shouty, look at me type bloke. And he started being quite pushy. So I thought, okay, fine, I'm going to be pushy right back. And at the end of it, he shook my hand and said, that was a great interview. Thank you, that was great. And the other example of that was Manfred Mann, when he was touring with Manfred Mann's Earth Band. Now, Manfred Mann is a very intelligent, very precise guy. And he wasn't enormously happy. And he started off bristling at me. And then after a while he said, well, these are actually some quite interesting questions here. And I said, well, it's very good of you to say so, And it got quite sarcastic. We were trading insults, but it got more and more affable. And at the end of the interview, I said, well, this has been half an hour of unalloyed pleasure. And he burst out laughing. And we left on very good terms. And I got a really spiky interview out of it. You have to judge it. Some people are vulnerable, some people are tough. So you just have to play it by ear. When thinking about best interviews, it's very difficult, especially with a music interview, because if you're interviewing as a fan, you can gush all over the artist, think it's utterly wonderful, and you're producing drivel that's not worth listening to. So if you can get some meat, some real interesting stuff, you can pick up on something they've said and follow it through, and that actually goes back to the opening up issue as well. If they start saying interesting stuff and giving you personal stuff, then I think that's successful. Lowell George, who was the creative genius behind a fabulous 70s band called Little Feat, was a wonderful, intelligent, super articulate interview. I suspect I was just being a fanboy and gushing because I loved that band so much. But other people, interestingly enough, Bonnie Raitt, when I interviewed her very early on in her career, she was fabulous. She was all full of fun, like we're talking mid-70s. She hadn't really broken through, but she gave a fantastic interview. 15 years later, she was successful, and I just ran into someone who had a brick wall up ahead of her. She gave you Teflon answers. Nothing you could object to, but she wasn't going to give of herself. Paul McCartney is legendary for that kind of thing as well. He gives great interview, he doesn't say anything. My worst interview ever was with the Stranglers. The Stranglers were coming around. Their manager had noticed the sensational impact that the Sex Pistols had had by crucifying Bill Grundy live on television. So they sent the Stranglers around under instruction to be as obnoxious as possible. I'd never run into that. I had never run into that degree of aggression and unpleasantness, and it really, really was an upsetting experience. The upshot of it was I never broadcast the interview. It was unbroadcastable, and I never played the Stranglers on any of my shows after that. So you could say that that was a terrible, mortifying experience. I did feel a little bit better about 6 months later when I got a fantastic sparky interview with Bob Geldof, so I thought, oh, they're not all dickheads in punk. But the Stranglers were deliberately vile, and that was a deliberate policy to go out and try and outrage the entire world of radio and see what happened. Not a lot happened. They eventually went middle of the road and had a hit with Golden Brown. But that didn't bother me. I still wasn't playing them. Top tips for wannabe interviewers. Do your research. Find out who you're talking to. That's tip number 1. Tip number 2, it's not you that matters. It's what you get from the interview, the program material you get that matters. And 3, treat your material with respect. Once you've got a good interview, present it properly. Don't just file it and think, oh, that was great. Your job's only really started when you've collected your basic raw material.
That was Robin Valk talking about skills needed to interview musicians. In the next podcast, Jules McCarthy will be talking about law and ethical considerations, as well as compliance on radio. Boring, some may think, but absolutely crucial. Until then, goodbye.